The problems associated with college drinking are now well known. Depending on the survey, something like 70 or 80% of students report drinking in the past month or past year, and this number, the 4 out of 40%, or 2 out of 5 students reporting some kind of heavy episode during the past 2 weeks. And this is by far the largest rates of heavy episodic drinking of any major demographic occur right in that college student age range. College students are not so much distinctive for the sheer amount that they're drinking. Honestly, if you line up the drinks per month or drinks per week between adults in one column and college students in the other, they're not that much different. But what is different is where adults might have a drink or two on every day, college students tend to save their drinks up and drink them all at once. And so you have this bunching together of drinks that occurs, the so-called binge or heavy episodes. And of course, the saddest part is this number. This is the number of students who die every year from alcohol-related deaths. Most of these are related to traffic fatalities, but there are a fair number of students that die directly from alcohol poisoning every year. Somewhere around 40 to 60 students die from alcohol poisoning. A very interesting analysis done a few years ago to determine the day of the week and the month of the year that college students were most likely to die from alcohol poisoning. What they found was that the day of the week was Sunday. It was actually Sunday because of Saturday night drinking. Isn't actually, the time of death isn't actually until Sunday, technically Sunday morning. And the month of the year that students are more likely to die from alcohol poisoning is, wait for it, December. It's December. So apart from this number, the 1700 number, there have been a lot of questions about what exactly occurs to make that number what it is, and the various other problems that are associated with college student drinking. We know that college students drink more than they did when they were in high school. But up until recently, it was unknown when exactly this change occurred. Typically, you would compare surveys that were done in high school to surveys that were done in college, and you determine that drinking goes up, and so you know that students are drinking more. But the question is when that occurs. At the beginning of the summer? Is it at the school year, right at the school year? Do students have to wait? It was a very interesting analysis we published just last month. It's in the current issue of Addictive Behaviors. And we used a data set. What you're going to see here is a very large data set of about 80,000 students at about 200 schools. And the survey was given at multiple waves. It was actually, students took it at all different times, all the way from 2 months before the start of the school year to 1 month after the start of the school year. So what you're going to see here is this is peak blood alcohol level, and what you see is over the summer it's flat, and whoa, 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 and it goes up. You see right at that dotted line there is the start date of the school year. And so you see a sort of a very interesting pattern if you're talking about drinking or peak drinking, of drinking remaining more or less flat over the summer, but accelerating almost to the day that school starts. And other surveys have suggested that there's this period until about 4 weeks where students accelerate their drinking, and there may be a little bit more tapering off as class requirements get more stringent. So peak blood alcohol level, of course, males are drinking more than females. Also with protective behaviors. Females tend to be more protective or more safe in the way that they drink. Except for this number, this was a very interesting analysis that we found, that although females tend to be more careful than males on several different measures, when you look at a subset of questions that we called intent to get drunk, and these are questions that ask, to what extent are you going out of your way to get intoxicated? To what extent are you doing shots? Are you doing drinking games? Are you pre-gaming before you go out for the evening? And on those measures, males and females, ironically, are about the same. Females are just as risky in their drunkenness-seeking behavior as are men. We couldn't get the video. I wanted to show you a video to work, and so I tossed in a few little bonus slides. This is a very interesting study. It was published a couple years ago that looked at the kind of problems that students report. This is a subset of relatively high-risk colleges, so don't take these numbers as representative of all college students. But this was the percent of college students who reported having this problem since the beginning of the school year. And you can see that problems like having a hangover or doing regrettable things or missing a class are relatively frequent. Two-thirds of college students are reporting, at least at these colleges, are reporting having had a hangover in the past year. But also other things like the perhaps more serious unplanned sexual activities or driving after drinking are still also quite common. These are certainly alarming to older adults. They're certainly alarming to many college students. But I think as we get into the notion of motivational interviewing and what motivates college students, it's important to think of the ways that college students may think of these particular consequences differently than would older members of the community. So one study that I'll show you in just a second took a well-known measure of consequences of drinking called the YAPST. And this has listed a number of consequences of drinking, and it's very widely used for college drinking research. And it asked the kind of the basic, kind of almost the dumb question of, to what extent are these things really problems? Like if these happen to you, to what extent would it really be a problem? And so what you have here are certain consequence items on the YAPS, things like being arrested or having your stuff stolen or receiving a lower grade, and then whether on the whole that would be a negative if that happened to you, or whether it would neither be negative nor positive, this neutral category, or whether it would actually be a positive. And so certain things like being arrested or having your things stolen or receiving a lower grade are pretty much rated by almost all students as being a negative. But interestingly, other things like at the bottom of the chart, things like eating more than you had planned, waking up in another's bed, having a hangover, are perceived as a negative by actually less than half of students. In fact, there's a substantial minority of college students that say if that thing happened, then it might actually be a positive. So this, I think, tells you a little bit about the mentality of some of the assumptions we may bring to the table of what kinds of things ought to be motivating to college students. But in fact, some of these things may not be that motivating. So I think it tells us a little bit about how our assumptions may be different in practice. My favorite item on this one is the regrettable sex here. You'll see sort of right in the middle. So 4.1% of college students said that regrettable sex was a positive, that would be a positive. Now, I'll point out that this is not any sex. This is regrettable sex, which I think is just a really fascinating kind of indicator. 4% of college students saying that if I had sex that was later regretted, it still would be a positive. I actually looked, someone asked whether this was just a bunch of horny freshman boys or something, and so I looked back at the publication, and in fact it's evenly split for males and females, equally likely to rate regrettable sex as potentially a positive. So I think keeping all this in mind, there have been a number of programs that have been evaluated in recent years that have begun to tailor motivational and cognitive behavioral and skills training and expectancy challenge interventions to these kinds of drinkers. So rather than in the old days, I guess I talk about olden days, but maybe prior to 10 or 15 years ago, college students were treated with a sort of, were seen as more or less junior alcoholics or alcoholics in training. And so given that assumption, there were a series of things like educational interventions or Alcoholics Anonymous sorts of interventions that were used and that made perfect sense given those assumptions. But now that we know an awful lot more about how college students are drinking and why they're drinking and what kinds of things motivate them to make changes, there have been a series of interventions that have been tailored more specifically to these kinds of drinkers. And one of them is motivational interviewing. So henceforth known as MI. I got to be careful what group I'm talking to. I talked to a group of cardiologists last week for whom an MI was a myocardial infarction. and was actually giving a talk to a group in South Africa a few years ago and talking about our work with heavy drinking fraternity and sorority members. And I used the term Greeks, which to me means, members of fraternities or sororities. And the Greeks drinking twice as much as other students and having all these problems. And a man raised his hand in the middle of my talk and in a very thick European accent says, I'm so confused. Who are these Greeks at your colleges and why are they drinking so much? So he literally thought I meant people from Greece. So I got to be careful and define my term here. Motivational interviewing is a style of talking with people. It's a conversational style, really, or a counseling style. It doesn't necessarily suggest activities to do. It's not something that would readily lend itself to a workbook intervention or self-guided intervention necessarily, but it does suggest a way of asking questions or making statements to make it more likely that people are talking and thinking in a particular direction. It has a theoretical base in client-centered sort of Rogerian therapy, and you'll see a large emphasis on open questions, on reflections, on complex reflections, on respect for client choice, and a lot of things that client-centered approaches would value. But it's also a directive kind of treatment. So whereas client-centered would, is at least according to Roger's original formulation, would be a non-directive, non-goal-oriented, really, so the counselor doesn't have in mind any particular goal. Motivational interviewing definitely does. And you'll see a set of strategies that are partly client-centered and a set of strategies that are partly directive or goal-oriented, and those two work together in motivational interviewing. It's also logically linked to stage of change, which suggests that people go through a series of cognitive steps when they consider making a change, and self-perception theory that says that the kind of language that I use partly changes attitude. So there may actually be a lot that you can do with a person to change their attitude if you're getting a person talking in a particular direction. So motivational interviewing has a way of shaping language, really, through the selection of questions you ask, through the kinds of reflections you're using, through the parts of speech that you're using and attending to that the client uses. MI is sometimes linked with cognitive behavioral or skills training or educational interventions, sometimes as a kind of first gear kind of strategy. So MI might be used on the outset to get a person more interested in using a skills training strategies, for instance, or educational intervention or something. Motivational interviewing might be used on the outset to help a person become more motivated to make use of those strategies. And I'll just skip to the last point and say that although the technique is somewhat important, the style is really emphasized over technique, and that's something that makes MI really different than a lot of other approaches in that it has a very explicit focus on the style of the intervention. I mentioned that MI is partly relational, it's partly non-directive, and you'll see a lot of Rogerian sorts of skills. But it's also partly technical in that there are decisions that the counselor is constantly making about attending to certain things that the client says and leaving other things behind. You can't be lazy when you're doing MI. You have to have a certain ear for the kinds of things you want to hear and want to hear more of. So talk briefly just about relational aspects. This little acronym OARS, open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries, summarizes some of the basic strategies that a counselor, an MI counselor, or really most counselors use to meet with students. So first of all, with open-ended questions, I'm sure you all know that there are different kinds of questions. Some questions are closed questions that may have a yes or no answer or a limited range of alternatives. So were you referred by the campus police is a closed question, or did you have alcohol, or had you been smoking, or do you drink, are examples of closed questions. And closed questions have some strengths. They minimize talk, they get you short answers, and they allow you to make easy decisions based on if a person was drinking at the time. Maybe they get one sort of response. And if they weren't drinking, then maybe they get a different response. But the logic of open-ended question is a question that asks for a longer, more elaboratory answer. So instead of saying, do you drink a lot, did you drink in high school, you say, tell me about your drinking, or tell me about your current drinking. Was there a time where you thought you drank too much becomes, tell me about a time that you thought that you drank too much. Do your parents have any concerns about your drug use becomes, what concerns does your parents have about your drug use? And on and on and on. So the logic of this is that you're giving people more opportunities. The questions are more assertive to get a person to give you longer, more sort of elaboratory kinds of answers. Instead of saying, can you think of anything that might work for you, or is there anybody that would be helpful to you? You're saying what things might work for you and who would be helpful to you. And finally, my favorite there is the what else? What else? What else? What else? People keep talking. So I do a fair amount of presenting, but I also do a fair amount of sitting in on presentations. And when I'm sitting in on presentations, I probably, like you, have some pet peeves about what speakers do. One of my pet peeves is speakers that begin their presentation with an apology. So I wasn't sure what we were supposed to talk about, or I didn't quite have the time to prepare that I wanted to, so begin with an apology. The other thing that bugs me is speakers that mutter their own internal dialogue. Speakers that say, it's not showing up, I don't know why it's not showing up on the screen. Maybe if I hit Control F8, I think that's the, where's the toggle? Well, it worked in my hotel room last night. I would hit, well, there it went on the screen. Oh, but it went away again. Why did it go? Speakers that mutter their own internal dialogue. The third thing that bugs me is speakers that run over their allotted time. So we're in a webinar. You can hang out. You can hang up whenever you want. But ordinarily, it's much more difficult to leave if the speaker's not finished. And so, almost invariably, I think a speaker will get 5 minutes to the end of their time, and they will either start to negotiate with the audience for extra time. They'll say, well, I see our time is almost out, but I'm wondering if I could just spend a couple more minutes talking about my important material. So either they'll negotiate for more time, or they'll start to talk at auctioneer's pace and cover every last one of those slides. Either way, a bad strategy. And then my top pet peeve is speakers that are limp in the way they facilitate a dialogue, and this is the same thing for counselors. So speakers or counselors that show something or illustrate something, and then they ask, so are there any questions about what I've just shown you? And nobody asks any questions. I think if you want questions, you should say, what questions do you have? Or how does that strike you? Or what about this seems like it might be useful, right? What else? What else? What else? And people will talk. And so I'm convinced that 50% of college students not talking to us is that we're just lazy in the way that we ask them to talk. So first of all, this explicit focus on asking open-ended questions to get people talking or thinking about what they're saying. These are just some useful questions. What are some things you like about your drinking or like about marijuana use? What are some of maybe the downsides for you? What concerns do you have about? Or give me an example of a time where that caused trouble for you, and so forth. This will all be posted. We'll post the presentation after this. The second basic skill is using statements rather than questions. One of my very early clients, this was actually when I was on an internship many years ago, and this was a police detective that I was seeing as my very first client of the day, and sort of my feet were still green. I was still getting into this counseling, and at one point he said something, and because I honestly had no insight or didn't really know what he was talking about, I literally took his words and I mixed them up and I just said them back to him. And his eyes opened and he sat straight up in the chair and he says, wow, I never thought of it that way. And it was such a strange experience because what I was saying to him was just what he had said to me. And so I asked him, well, don't you understand how this is working? I just told you what you told me. And he says, huh, well, yeah, I guess that's right, but when you say it, it makes so much sense. So the moral of the story is, just because people say it, it doesn't mean that they get it. They may need to hear it from you. Reflections can range all the way from simple repetition. So you're here because the Dean of Students made you come here, or you're here because you were caught holding a beer, to something that rewards or perhaps gives the emotion. It makes you angry. You're angry because you have to be here. You feel mistreated. You feel judged. You feel like this is labeling you. This is hard for you. This is really difficult for you. This is embarrassing for you. All of those are really terrific emotion sorts of reflections. So things like giving both sides. So on the one hand, you did what you thought was best that night in terms of driving home, but on the other hand, in retrospect, it seems like probably it wasn't the best choice. So giving both sides. So reflections have two uses in motivational interviewing. One use is to be able to roll with resistant comments, angry, reluctant, hostile sorts of resistant comments. So like this, it's not that big a deal. Everybody I know uses weed. And so using a reflection is one sort of subset of skills that are used to sort of wave the white flag and to disarm resistant talk. So a kind of a reflective response to this would be something like, so it doesn't seem like that big a deal, or it seems normal to you. That would be a kind of reflection response to this. A reflection response to this, I don't know why I'm here, this whole thing is stupid. So it seems stupid, it seems dumb. It's confusing to you why you should be singled out when other people who were at the same party got off differently. Or this whole thing seems like a waste of time to you. So those are just a couple examples of reflections used to roll with resistance. Here are some other useful statements that you'll see. And by the way, a lot of these come from our book. I'll share the slide with you a little later in the talk. At this point, it doesn't seem that big a deal to you. Drinking has some positive aspects for you. It might be hard for you to make a change in that, and so forth. The third basic skill is using affirmations. Affirmations are make something explicit that is either something that the client is doing well or something that's interesting about the client. So thanks for taking care of that. Thanks for coming in. That's a really great idea. I think that will work for you. Or something that is more interesting about the client. Something along the lines of, you know, it's interesting, you know, I see with these questions you're asking that you really want to think about whether this is going to work for you. It's going to be right for you. Or something along the lines of, you know, I get that because of your position in the fraternity house, what you do makes a big difference for others because people are watching you for clues as to what, you know, what normal, responsible behavior is. All of those things are affirmations, and they have a way of really creating a lot of momentum in a conversation. And finally, before you leave, connecting the dots. So let me see if I've got this straight. Or let me just give you a recap and see if I've got this right. Not only what the student has said, but also what they've decided, what their most important reasons for making that change are. These basic skills of ORS form really both the process of the relational components, that is an explicit emphasis on listening and eliciting client speech, but they also form the core of the more strategic or directional elements, the same basic strategies of ORS. One of the very interesting things about motivational interviewing is that there have been a number of language studies done on the kind of client speech that's more likely to predict a certain client outcome. What they found is that clients who make more statements during a counseling session about desire, wanting to change, ability, I could change, or someone would be helpful to me, or there's some resources that would help, or reasons, so if I made a change, then the benefit would be I would lose weight, I would save money, I'd get out of trouble with my roommate, with my RA, whoever, and need, just sort of miscellaneous statements, I just got to do something about those. When people make statements along those lines about a desire, ability, reasons, or need, people are more likely to make commitment statements. So I will. I'll look into that this week. I'll have to keep track of the amount that I'm drinking. I'll have to cut down on that drinking during the week. I'll have to make sure that I'm only drinking in safe environments, or not drink more than one drink an hour, something like that. People are more likely to make those commitment statements, and when people make those statements, those kind of commitment statements, they're far more likely to make positive changes. It's a very interesting pattern where you can actually do a decent job predicting how well people end up in terms of their drinking by just looking at the language they use during a brief interaction with somebody. And so the task in motivational interviewing in the directional element is to be able to use those skills, open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries, to have a kind of ear and respond to client statements. So when clients are making statements about, I want to do well in school, or ability statement, I could do that, or my roommate would be helpful to me, a reason statement, if I limited my drinking, I guess it would, it would be easier, make my classes easier, and so forth. When you're hearing those kinds of statements, that you're reinforcing those with open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. Now, for instance, this one, I'd like to be able to study more. This is a kind of desire statement, and so one way to reinforce that and to allow the person to elaborate more on that statement, which we want to do because the more statements like this a person makes, the more likely they are to do it. So we're following up, let's say, with an open question. Why would you like to be able to study more? Or what would be the benefit to you in terms of your schoolwork? How would that make things better in school? Or an affirmation. So it's great that you're really thinking about what you can do to improve your college grades. Or reflection. This is really something you want. You want to be able to study more and do well in school. So all of those have the effect of encouraging the student to give you more talk like this. Here's another one. If I wanted to be more careful about my drinking, I guess my coach would help me out. This is kind of an ability statement because it talks about someone or something that would be helpful to them. It's a resource. And so following this up with an open question, so how would you, how would your coach be helpful to you? Or who else would be helpful to you? Or an affirmation statement. It's terrific that you have that kind of relationship with your coach that you feel comfortable enough talking to him about this. Or a reflection. So one thing that might be helpful to you is talking with your coach. That's something you are considering. So following that up with something that has a person elaborate more on this kind of statement. Now, both those kinds of statements there require, one, that you're listening for and attending to certain kinds of statements. They require that you have a kind of an ear for the kinds of things that you want to hear more of. Now, in reality, I think what you'll find is, although I've just shown you two statements that are change talk kinds of statements, in reality what you have most time is a sort of a creamy motivational middle surrounded by a hard bedrock of a bunch of other kind of talk. And if it were just as easy as a student give you nothing but change talk, this would not be any kind of skill at all. The skill is learning to discern the statement that's more likely to pay off motivationally and to be able to extract that from the rest of the talk using open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. So for instance, this one. My roommate has really started to bug me about my drinking, but that's okay. She nags me about a lot of stuff. So this person is saying at least three things. First of all, the roommate has some concerns about drinking, that the roommate's worries are not his worries, and that the roommate worries about a lot of other things. So what you say next makes a difference because it determines whether this client here talks about the roommate's concerns about the drinking, about why her concerns are not his concerns, or why the roommate has a lot of other concerns. What you say next makes a difference. So from a motivational standpoint now, there's really only one right answer. And if you can get it, then you have an ear for the kinds of things you want to hear. For my money, it's really the first one here. The roommate has some concerns about the drinking is the one that's more likely to pay off. Now, wait, you say, but that's not his concerns. Well, yes, but it's the roommate's concerns. And it might be a way to talk about his concerns sort of by proxy, either through an open-ended question, what are her concerns, what's your roommate's concerns, or who else is concerned, or an affirmation. So it's great you're at least considering your roommate's opinions on this, even though it kind of bugs you. Or a reflection. So it sounds like your roommate has some concerns about this, either as a single reflection or as a double-sided reflection. So even though you don't necessarily have a lot of concerns, it sounds like your roommate at least is concerned. I used a double-sided reflection with a change part last. Your roommate has some concerns. And there's a very strategic way about using double-sided reflections by leaving that change part last. It makes it more likely that he'll elaborate on that part. Let me give you an example. So the two elements really here are the roommate's concerned, but the client's not concerned. So those are the two elements. Let me say it two ways using a double-sided reflection. So your roommate has some concerns, but you're not that concerned. And let me switch it. You're not that concerned, but it sounds like your roommate has some concerns. Do you hear the difference? Whatever comes last is the thing that people are more likely to pay attention to. And so in sort of a strategic way to reflect, either is as a single reflection, saying to this, so it sounds like your roommate has some concerns, or as a double-sided reflection that leaves the change part last. So even though you don't necessarily have some concerns, it sounds like there are some other people that have concerns. So in either case, that's the way to make it more likely that the client is going to talk about this element. My roommate is bugging me about my drinking. Now, I'll go back to these other options here. Those of you who, sorry about that. Those of you who were perhaps thinking about the second element, that her worries are not his worries, this is exactly the opposite of what we're looking for. So if you're asking, so why isn't that a concern for you? What you've asked for is for him to tell you basically all his reasons he's not motivated, or people are not concerned, or he shouldn't be concerned about their views. It's actually the opposite of what we're looking for. And the final element, the roommate has a lot of other concerns, is really another direction entirely. Now, any of these may be perfectly good targets depending on what you're looking for. But if you're looking for a way to maximize desire, ability, reasons, and need, this kind of change talk in motivational language, the first element has a higher likelihood of payoff. Here's one here. One of these days I'll probably drink less, but for now I'm a college student. I'm only going to be young once. So again, here there's one element in here that's probably more likely to pay off in terms of motivational speech. For my money, it's the first one. One of these days I'll probably drink less. And so following it up with a question like, so I'm curious, at what point would you think about drinking less, or why would you do that? Or an affirmation, perhaps a reflection that says, even though you enjoy drinking now, you can't really see yourself continuing to drink like this long term. You think eventually things are going to change. So that's the way to attend to that particular statement. So what do you do with the rest of it? I'm only young once, I'm a college student. What do you do with that? Well, in fact, you just leave it. The fact of the matter is you cannot attend every kind of part of speech that a person gives you. You constantly pick and choose what you're going to reinforce and what you're going to leave behind. And so if you're reinforcing motivational talk, then it's really the first element there. Similarly to this, it probably wasn't the best idea to drive home from the party, but it's not like I caused an accident or anything. So you have really two elements. You have the first element that's more change talk-like, and you have the second element that's really the opposite of that. It's counter change talk. And so it would probably be a mistake to pay attention to that last part and to say something like, either as a sort of corrective statement, well, yeah, you didn't cause an accident, but you certainly could have, something like that, or a question, why did you think that was a good idea at the time? Because both of those are going to get you more of kind of counter change talk, which predicts a poorer prognosis, poorer outcome. The best, from a motivational standpoint, the best target is probably the first one. So even though you didn't cause an accident, it sounds like you do have some sense that it probably wasn't the best decision to be driving that night. So why is that? I mean, what gave you that sense? So that's a way to pay attention to that first element very strategically to maximize a student's talk. MI is different from other approaches in that it's collaborative, working together, and it's evocative. Really, the best scenario is that the client is doing the bulk of the work. I'm sometimes asked, how do you know whether an interaction with a student drinker is a good one? Well, I think one marker is if the student is more tired at the end of the conversation, that's a good marker because it tells me he did more of the work, the student did more of the work. Because it's not your job, the counselor's job, the RA, the RD, it's not your job to be doing the work. It's the student's job. And so thinking of, is there a way that we can ask questions or make statements so that a student is thinking about the material and coming up, generating that change talk. That's what I mean by evocative. It evokes a student's motivation rather than invokes. But it's also strategic, as we've mentioned. So it's strategic in the use of questions and reflections to elicit a kind of change talk, which will then predict a better outcome, so change drinking. This webinar is a very brief presentation. There are lots of individual strategies that target specifically getting a person more motivated or shifting to talking about change and planning. There are lots of different configurations of the different techniques that can be used if you have just a few minutes or if you have a longer counseling session. One of the things I would just mention, at least since it's used so frequently, is using MI with a feedback profile. When motivational interviewing is used with a feedback profile, like many of you maybe use eChug or eToke, one of those printouts, or may work with the basics folks, so the basics intervention. All of these are a kind of subset of motivational interviewing, or I guess packaging of MI that's called motivational enhancement therapy. What that is motivational interviewing with a feedback profile is all that is. So for instance, basics, which some of you may know, is it involves motivational interviewing paired with a feedback profile, paired with some sort of skills training and self-monitoring and a few other skills. Feedback, motivational or personalized feedback, has been used in several studies. It's been used on its own, so students filling out questionnaires and being mailed personalized feedback, or completing questionnaires online and clicking submit and receiving instant feedback online, or receiving feedback via a counseling session, a brief counseling session. All of these different approaches have been shown to be reasonably effective. Probably, according to our research, the in-person, if you're sitting down with a person and going over a feedback profile in an MI style, probably that's the kind of the gold standard approach. And the longest term results, the best and longest positive outcomes have been found using that approach. Whereas most of the online or mailed feedback, the gains are in the short term, sort of 2 to 3 months, maybe up to 6 months, but then the gains pretty much dissipate from most of these online or mailed approaches. This is just an example of some screenshots of an older version from the eChug. I think it may be that several of you use this. This is the Checkup to Go. It's administered by the nonprofit San Diego State University Foundation. It's something that gets customized to your campus. And this is a screenshot of an older version, only because the older version lends itself a lot better to screenshots. The newer version is more interactive. So what it involves is, if you're sitting down with a student and using these bits of feedback that are generated from the student's assessment, a prior assessment, as a way to sort of elicit a reaction or to elicit talk from these variables. So in this example here, the student reported drinking 86 standard drinks per month, which is about 20 standard drinks in a week. You can see the amount of money spent on alcohol, and at the bottom there are the caloric equivalent in terms of the number of cheeseburgers. So a typical light beer has around 100 calories. A cheeseburger has around 300 calories, and so you can sort of do a rough conversion there for students. And in a motivational interviewing session where you're walking through feedback, what it would involve is moving slowly through the feedback, explaining the variable once, but not defending it, and then asking a question or watching for clues as a way to reflect what the student is saying, so that you're getting a kind of reaction from the student. So so in a typical scenario, I might, first of all, I would probably chunk these first two numbers, and I would say, so on the baseline assessment, you reported drinking 86 standard drinks per month, which is about 20 standard drinks in a week. How does that strike you? And I would just wait. It may be that the student says, wow, that's a lot. More commonly, the student says, I think maybe your number's wrong, or that seems like a lot more than I reported. In which case, you're just reflecting. So it seems like a lot to you, or it seems unbelievable, or it's hard to believe, or you're surprised, or something along those lines. Another element in most feedback sheets is this one that compares the students' drinking to campus or national norms. And in a typical scenario, what I might do is the first item there compares the students' drinking to national norms. And I would say, so in the survey that you filled out, you guessed that about half of college students, college males, drink more than you. But comparing your results to national surveys suggests that maybe only 10% do. What do you think about that? And again, just wait. You just wait. And either a student says, wow, that's a lot, or well, students lie on the survey, so I don't know that it's such a big deal, or there's a range of reactions that then get reflected. So it's surprising to you, or it's not surprising to you, or it doesn't seem that big a deal, or it's really, you don't know what to make of this, or something along those lines. And then the student talks, and then there's a series of statements that the student says something, and then you're either following with a question or reflection to get the student thinking about that. The most important thing is not the student believes the numbers, and that's why we should never try and defend the numbers and explain and try and defend the core survey or wherever these numbers came from. The most important thing is the student is thinking about these numbers and walks away having thought about, wow, wrong or right, those numbers are really different. And so that's what we want the student to be thinking. The other part, so the one sort of trick maybe about feedback is that we should never defend the feedback. It stands on its own. We're just a sort of a guide for the student. The second maybe little trick is that not all fish bite on the same hook. And that's why most feedback reports use several different elements. For instance, the eChug uses drinks per week, drinks per month, amount of money, calories, tolerance, audit score, and all these different sorts of norm comparisons. Because you'll often find that a student may really be surprised or disturbed or whatever by one of those elements, but not so much by the others. And that, again, is okay. Fish only need to bite on one hook. They don't have to bite on all hooks. And so it's a way to get students thinking about that and maybe a little, disturbed or a little surprised and walk away having thought about those things. I'll just flash a few because I know we're about out of time and I wanted to allow some time for questions. If you have questions, feel free to type those in. I will just mention some resources that are available to you. There are lots of books. The Basics Manual is the one at the top. Cynthia Kuhn, this is a wonderful book. I've used it for and seen it used for talking with individual college students, for teaching. It's an extremely readable book about alcohol and drugs. There's our book there, Talking with College Students About Alcohol. The one sort of different thing about our book that's not in the Basics Manual is it covers how to do this in a lot of different formats. Basics is a 2-session individual intervention. It's counseling. And so it's not an intervention that is necessarily designed for groups. It's certainly not designed for very brief sessions like you're in a college health setting. But our book talks about all of those different formats: groups, very brief interactions, moderate range interactions, long interactions. And even if you don't want the book, there's a free PowerPoint presentation which you can download at that website there. And then finally, we also created a training DVD for the Illinois Higher Education Center. They sell it at cost. It's on their website there, and it contains lots of different clips of motivational interviewing being used in practice, just brief little 5 or 6 minute segments of different components, and also some sort of cheat sheets and things that might be helpful. So I will hold that there, and we have just a few minutes, I think, for question. Eric, do you want to take it away again?
Sure. We had one question come in. How do you feel about the use of choices as a tool for students who have been cited for misusing alcohol?
So by choices, I think that they mean the workbook approach. Is there anything else in the...
Yes.
I'll just assume that they're talking about the workbook that's the Change Company's workbook.
Correct. Yeah, the submitter said that's correct.
Yeah. I think there is some evidence in adult populations that self-guided manuals can be effective. I haven't seen a really good study among college students that uses the Choices workbook. If it were me, probably I think that something that's like the Choices workbook that's paired with a counseling session, either with a professional or perhaps even with a peer, that talks about the student's reaction. And all it is just a way to get a student thinking about something. So yeah, I don't have a preference one way or the other, but it certainly is a nice product, and there's probably probably easily integrated with individual or sort of group approaches.
Thank you.
Even though there isn't a huge amount of research evidence behind it, but they got a lot of smart people that created it.
Yes, another audience member writes, using resources such as eChug or alcohol.edu are great, but oftentimes Residence Life staff uses them for sanctioning as a tool for judicial conferences. How do you suggest that we utilize these resources in a more productive format?
Yeah, judicial. So I'm talking as sort of like I talk partly about maybe people who are identified as heavy drinkers, and most of the evidence is coming from research studies where you're screening in people that are heavy drinkers. But in fact, on the college campus, the majority of time that you're going to get people in a counseling setting is when they've been busted for something. So I think it makes sense to think of something like a stepped care approach, where, and many colleges do this, where a first-time infraction, or if you're screening people based on the audit or something through the Student Health Center, some kind of first contact might involve something like alcohol EDU for sanctions, or the Under the Influence is a competing product, and so something along those lines, a brief. I mean, again, it depends on the amount of resources that your campus has, and to think about something like an in-person motivational interviewing for a second contact. The eChug actually works quite handily for a kind of MI second contact, where you ask the person to go and complete the program and print out their feedback and bring it to you. And so not only do they get that online experience, but they also they're talking with the counselor about it. I would probably not, and I think the evidence is not that good for high-risk groups. We used to do a lot of these when students were busted, and we'd wait a month or 6 weeks until we had a dozen students and bring them all into a room and give them a 2 or 3 hour educational intervention. There is not good evidence for those groups, and so I wouldn't do it. I would use something that's less intensive, like Under the Influence or EDU for sanctions for first-time offense, or maybe an educational group or something. But for second-time offense, I would definitely go with something like a motivational intervention, perhaps with feedback.
Sure. That's all the questions that were submitted at this time, but I want to remind everyone you still have an opportunity to submit those. I did come up with a question, Scott. Somebody had mentioned a desire to maybe share this information with their RA staff. Are you aware of any institutions currently that are using this as part of their training model for student staff?
Oh, you're talking about RAs as students.
Yeah, RAs as
Um,
peers.
Let me think of the. I know that a number of colleges are doing something like this, and there actually is a fair amount of research on peer kind of MI interventions. Um, I I don't know that I could name specific colleges, but I think it's definitely worth your time in terms of thinking about getting RAs using something like motivational interviewing. What the research suggests is that even though peer counselors are not as good, so the fidelity is not as good, they don't cover all the elements, they don't like necessarily stick to MI in the way the professionals do, their outcomes seem to be the same. So what they're lacking in MI, they're making up for in something else, and identification or something like that. And so I think it's definitely worth your time to check out Bacchus Gamma or some of the other organizations that are working with peers around this.
Thank you. And we have one more question. What are your suggestions for dry campuses and educating students on healthy or safe drinking behaviors?
Well, um, I guess the question is, how are dry campuses different than wet campuses in terms of the way that they educate students? Um, I I guess I'd have to think about that a little more. I think many of and I'm assuming, because as you all know, there's all these different iterations. So you have dry campuses, you have wet campuses, you have some dry campuses that also have an honor code in which people can't drink, and so I think we're talking about the sort of the middle picture there. But I think more often than not, many of the issues are the same. Um, Drinking is certainly not tolerated at campus, but students can still drink. They can drink off campus. And so many of the skills that you would use in wet campuses are going to be the same. Um, I think perhaps with some of the differences are being some of the kind of the transportation issues and moving back and forth. If you're drinking, more likely to drink off campus, then you have to get back to campus, and so that may be a little bit more of an issue. I'm sorry that answer wasn't probably that great.
No problem. And the last question we're going to take for this session, are you aware of institutions that allow for breathalyzer tests at the time of the incident in order to determine a BAC?
No. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. That's an interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would have to think about that question too. No, I'm not. What I know is institutions that sometimes use breathalyzers as a way to provide feedback to students, like late night breathalyzing students as a way to provide feedback to students, but that's really different. Sorry.
Thank you. No, that's okay. Thank you, Scott. Actually, one more question snuck in right
Yeah.
under the buzzer here, so we'll go with this one. Can you comment on Labrie's work on group motivational enhancement?
Yeah. So Joe Labrie has done probably the major work on using MI in groups. And we actually have a chapter on this in our book as well, but I will say that groups are different than individuals, and they require really a lot of thought about how you're going to integrate feedback, and in many of Joe's studies, they've been more uh, most of Joe's studies have not been high-risk mandated sorts of populations. They've been a mix of students, and that's true of the adult literature as well. But I would definitely consider some of the ways that groups are different than individuals. The dynamics are different. People defend themselves differently. They take feedback differently than they do with individuals. Yeah, and I would encourage you to either read his book or read his work or check out the chapter in our book.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. I think we're out of time for today. Ladies and gentlemen, we're excited that you joined us for today, and I know that this is a lot of great information. This entire presentation, the recording, will be posted on our website sometime later today or tomorrow at the latest. It'll be available at www.glucuho.org/webinars, or you can also find it on the Glucuho webpage under the resources heading. Look for webinar archives. This is great information, and I would encourage you to share it with anyone in your institutions that would have a desire for this info. Thank you again, Scott. Excellent presentation today.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. And we want to wish everyone the best today, and look forward to seeing folks at the Glucuho conference in November. Have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone.